Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Brendan Dougherty and L. Brent Bozell III.
Yeah, got it right. Yes, yes. Do I get him?
Let there be light. Good afternoon. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. So glad to have you. And I'm so glad, and I'm so very lucky to be hosting Brent Bozell here today to talk a little bit about the history of the conservative movement, his father, his own role in it. L. Brent Bozell, if you do not know, is the founder of the Media Research Center, which he created in 1987 to help understand and rectify liberal bias in media. He's one of 10 children of L. Brent Bozell Jr. and Trish Buckley, the favorite sister of our founder, William F. Buckley Jr. Brent's father was Bill's Yale debate partner, who went on to write one book with Bill, McCarthy and His Enemies, before helping him to found National Review in 1955. Brent will talk about some of the lessons learned from what his father and uncle achieved in founding the magazine, and with it, the modern American conservative movement, and how that inspired decades of work in American conservatism afterward. Also, most recently, Brent Bozell has been asked by President Trump to serve as the next CEO of the United States Agency for Global Media. Please give a round of applause and welcome him here.
Thank you.
Your father and uncle met as students at Yale and became fast friends through their relationship as debate partners. They also caused quite a scene. They were noticed immediately. What can we learn about that time of theirs together? It seems to me that their presence on Yale sort of brought light to or highlighted this emerging liberal establishment consensus that was being built at universities and coming to define the rest of America. What was it just that, broad colors stood out against those pale pastels, or what was it that kind of sparked their relationship and put them on the path that they were on?
Well, I think it was more than that. And boy, could Yale use some of it right now. No, it was, I think what they brought to the table was a 1-2 punch that was devastating in a debate. Bill was the surgeon. He went in with the analytical argument. He looked for the weakness in his opponent, and he filleted his opponent when it was his turn. My dad was the orator. He had won a national oratory contest in high school against 16,000 other entrants in it, which is what got him his scholarship to Yale. And the two of them could debate that way. And there was this one story about one debate they had, and it was a Vassar team or something. And the two young ladies there tried and failed, because when it was Bill's turn, he absolutely demolished his opponent and reduced her to tears. And so, someone who was there, my mother told me about it, and she said, when he did that, she said, oh my God, they've gone too far this time. And then their opponents are weeping on stage. And my dad apparently stood up, and his closing argument was agreeing that they should weep over their ideas. They won.
No mercy at all. How did the liberal establishment at first react to them? Because we read some of these accounts of this time at Yale, and it seems at some level they were a little bit stars on campus, and there was some level of pride, but also a level of fear. So, Bill might get a speaking slot at graduation and then be protested by some of the professoriate. So what was the kind of climate that they were going into?
Well, I think the intellectuals on campus respected them. Disagreed with them, obviously, vehemently, but respected them. those who weren't so sophisticated despised them. And that really continued, if you think about it, through most of their careers. There was a turning point with Bill at some point, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, where there was a seismic change in how he was perceived. And it became a very loving perception, I think, by the time of his death. But before that, he was, we all remember how he was vilified, but he loved it. He truly enjoyed it. And my dad, the same thing. I mean, the two of them were fearless. And they believed they were right. And when you believe you're right, and you can defend your argument the way they could defend it, they became fearless.
So they come out of school, and the great controversy of the day, the great lightning rod in American politics is Senator Joe McCarthy. And conservative anti-communists who had so much to lament after the war, right? In the years after the war, they see literally hundreds of millions of people fall under communist rule worldwide, and they view the State Department and the Truman administration as just bungling and ineffectual. Here comes Joe McCarthy, and I don't know if people appreciate today just how rude it seemed to a lot of Americans and to the establishment to even tolerate Joe McCarthy, let alone defend him full tilt. And in a way, I think we see echoes of this in politics today, with Donald Trump being a popular champion that a lot of conservative intellectuals would be afraid to defend, but in the 40s and 50s, your father and your uncle were not afraid to go out in front of controversy.
I'll tell you a funny story about that, about Joe McCarthy. So I was in the green room of C-SPAN a few years ago, and I ran into Kathy Townsend Kennedy, who's then Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. And I don't know why I knew these facts, but we greeted each other. She was very, very friendly, very kind. And I said, I've got to tell you something. We have two things in common. And she said, really? And I said, yeah. I said, the first is we share the same birthday. And she lit up and she said, oh, well, that's very nice. What's the second? And I said, we both share the same godfather. And she went pale in front of me. And I mean, all the blood just drained out of her face. And she smiled wanly and she left. Our godfather was Joe McCarthy. And just imagine her trying to explain that to her constituents. You know, the left refuses, just absolutely refuses to believe they were wrong about Joe McCarthy. Read Stan Evans' book. Stan researched Joe McCarthy for years, and the Venona papers and everything else. And he found that on virtually everything that Joe McCarthy did, he was right. Now, Bill and my dad, when they went on tour on this book, they were just hammered for what they wrote. And I forget it was Bill or my dad, I think it was my dad, pointed out that they had 86 criticisms of Joe McCarthy in there. So they weren't papering over him. It was more the way he did it than what he did that did it. But he was a kind of a tragic figure personally. But he's someone they both admired. My dad especially. You know, my father was called by him. His hearings weren't going very well. And he was the junior guy under Roy Cohn. And Joe McCarthy asked him to write his speech that he was going to deliver to the Senate. So my dad wrote it, and he said, now if you give this thing, you're going to be censored. And Joe looked at it, and he said, I like it. And he gave it, and he was censored. And then several years later, forget the senator from Connecticut, whose son was also a senator, Dodd, got embroiled in some scandal, and I forget what that was. And he contacted my dad, and he asked my dad if he would write him his speech. My dad said, sure. And he wrote the speech and he gave it to him. And he said, if you deliver this speech, you'll be censored. And so Dad read it and liked it, delivered it, and was censored. And no one ever asked my dad to write another speech for them.
One of the most important essays that your father wrote for NR was called Freedom or Virtue. And it was meant as a challenge to Frank Meyer's outline of fusionism. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about this core question for conservatism today? And is it just something that we will be wrestling with eternally over these issues?
I recommend that everyone read that debate. It's timeless. It could be delivered today. And read it both from the standpoint of style and substance. First, the style. The two of them were vicious in this debate. I mean, they went for the jugular. They were also closest of friends, and they would spend all day long on the phone. Priscilla Buckley had a joke about the only thing that ever interrupted a conversation between Brent Bozell and Frank Meyer was another call from Brent Bozell or Frank Meyer to the other person. They just were always debating this internally. So look for style to see how one really ought to debate. And it's very sad. It's I don't know how many thousand words this debate was. Again, stylistically, you could have a lengthy discussion. And then the memory banks don't allow it anymore, which is very sad. Now, to the substance, this will be a debate that will go on and on and on. And it wasn't, that there's this I think there is a position that Frank was pushing fusionism. He really wasn't. He was pushing libertarianism. And my dad was pushing traditionalism. And ultimately, it became fusionism. And I think Frank ultimately became an acolyte of that position. But the debate of freedom versus virtue is one of libertarian versus traditionalism. And I do recommend, I've read it countless times, it never gets old. I recommend that everybody read that to see what a real debate was like.
Yeah. There's another debate I want to quote from to also give a little flavor. Your father founded Triumph magazine and wrote a very famous essay that to me reads like so much of later work, recent work I've read, recent work that's been aimed at me or at National Review or others. It was called Letter to Yourselves. And this is almost directly addressing Bill Buckley. He says, historians will differ as to the moment when the movement you lead ceased to be an important force in America. My own view is that the hour struck in 1964 with Goldwater's defeat. But there will be no one to dispute that it was all over by November 1968 with Nixon's victory. This is because Nixon in 1968 was your man. And Nixon in 1968 had repudiated you. He was your man in the sense that whatever remained of your energies was committed to his election, and whatever remained of your hopes was committed to the success of his presidency. He had repudiated you in the sense that he had pointedly and recognizably rejected every distinctive feature of your movement, that is, everything that set it apart from other political forces in this country. He had rejected everything that gave it an identity, or more to the point, a being. Now, I think we can't help but read these words and think of, in some ways, the position National Review may be in today, where we are cautious cheerleaders and critics of an administration that is not always friendly in return. What do you think of this moment in your father's life and in this moment of foreshadowing, maybe, for the conservative movement?
Well, first, the personal. Probably the single most painful moment of his life. Yeah, it was aimed at Bill. They were best friends in college. And my dad had started moving away from the movement. not from the standpoint of opposition to the movement, but finding more important things in his life, which was Catholicism. We moved to Spain in '60 for a couple of years, and that's where a real transformation came back. So when he came back, he didn't have the energy. He was still writing for National Review. I think he had been the Washington editor at the time. He didn't have the passion that he had going in. And then it just grew and grew, and then Nixon came about. And in fact, if you look at Nixon's record, he was quite liberal with his domestic policies, quite liberal. National Review was pragmatic. My dad wasn't. The biggest victim of this was my mother, who was Bill's closest sister and madly in love with my dad. And she was caught in the middle of this. So it was sad. Now, from the standpoint of policy, I would suggest that maybe that's what distinguished a lot of with Ronald Reagan in 1976, 1980, kind of a role reversal. But there were a lot of conservatives who were happy with Gerald Ford and could go along with Gerald Ford from a pragmatic standpoint. And National Review took the hard line on that with Ronald Reagan. Actually, go back to '68, where it really began. So there's been that tension all along of those who are more pragmatic. You know, Bill took the position, the famous position. He was always for the most conservative Republican. My dad wasn't. My dad even wasn't a Republican. So at the end, that was a schism. They tried to reconcile, and they couldn't. They visited. They would talk for hours at the pool in Stamford. They couldn't reconcile. Now, I can tell you, from a very personal standpoint, they loved each other madly, and Bill was shattered when my dad died.
After that period of time, you know, the rise of the life issue in American politics. You have Roe v. Wade, and I think that begins to draw the Bozell family back toward the movement and its institutions. Can you describe the effect of that on your family's political history, where you'd gone to Spain, you'd gone searching for Christian civilization, the deepest roots, and then this issue comes in American politics that I think touches on the deepest question: who are we? What made me?
I think my dad would tell you that his belief was that if Western civilization has come to the point where it's acceptable to kill your babies, then Western civilization should go to the ash heap of history. He was that despondent. He was looking at the postmodern world, post-Western civilization, because he was very, very negative on the what he believed was going to be the outcome of it, and so the triumph world didn't have any patience for anyone who was in the least bit pragmatic, and there was even Bill was obviously staunchly pro-life, unquestionably pro-life. They differed on contraception. There was a debate there, but on abortion there wasn't. I think my dad believed that National Review was being too weak corporately on the pro-life position, and he was probably right about that one. Now, what's happened since that time? I think that it's been ebbing and flowing, but not with National Review. It hasn't been ebbing and flowing. It's been strong.
I want to talk a little bit about your work too. What inspired you in 1987 to found Media Research Center, and did you feel at the time that you were continuing the fights that had started a generation earlier with your father and your uncle, or was this a new thing, a newly pressing thing that had a certain need in the 1980s that wasn't being met?
That's what it was. That's exactly what it was. We, as most here are familiar know, we just lost Tony Dolan, Ronald Reagan's speechwriter. He just passed. Tony's brother was Terry Dolan, who, very sadly, it's very sad, history will never remember who he was. He was probably the single most consequential political strategist in the conservative movement in the second part of the 20th century, and no one knows who he was. He headed the National Conservative Political Action Committee, which had had monumental successes. Rich Lowry, Tony Dolan was also 26 or 27 when he started the organization. But by 1981, there had been these terrific victories. But what I was seeing going into 1982 and early into 1983 was I was starting to feel like that Greek figure Sisyphus, rolling the boulder up the hill only to have it come back down. We had such great ideas in the movement, and yet so few of them were getting across the finish line because there was always an onslaught from the media that was redefining what the issue was, and perceptions, reality, and politics. And we had our political action committees, we had our foundations, we had our lobbying organizations, that the movement was pretty well stocked. And yet we really had no effort to do anything about the biggest problem we had, which was the national media. You had Reed Irvine, and God bless that man, but he had 30,000 followers, and that was it. And he was focused on the Vietnam War, and by God, he wouldn't let go of that one. But we had nothing against Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, and company. And by the way, I never thought I would rue the good old days of Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, and Peter Jennings. But there was nothing at all. So I was in a parking lot at the Hertz parking lot at DFW Airport one afternoon with Terry, and I suggested that we needed to go in that direction, and we needed to start an effort. That led to starting the Media Research Center as a project. And I remember Terry, when he did the first press conference when we announced it, he was asked by a reporter, "What's your goal?" And Terry's answer was, "For you to hear the damn footsteps behind you." That was Terry's sense of humor. So we started it as a project in late 83. In 1986, I just had the sense this was going to be a big thing. So I turned to Bill Rusher, then publisher of National Review, and I asked him to head a board of directors that I was setting up to launch it. We incorporated it, and then in 1987, we spun it off, and here we are today.
Yeah, and I think of in the history of media since that time, from the mid-1980s through the late 1990s up until basically the financial crisis, mainstream media was an unbelievably profitable business. Just the kind of salaries magazine writers could get in mainstream magazines were just astonishing. I read one this week, a Vanity Fair writer who confessed that for 3 pieces a year, he was paid $491,000 annually in 1990s money. That world is shattered and gone now.
Yeah.
By the internet, by Craigslist, by just the changing business model. So before we throw it out to questions in a few minutes, I want to ask, what do you make of the media landscape today? I mean, some analysts say that the media Americans are consuming now is actually starting to tilt to the right when you factor in podcasts like the Joe Rogan Show or some of these alternative media forces, the Daily Wire, et cetera. What do you think? What do you think about this world? Could you have imagined it before? Is it preferable to what came before, or has it cabined us off from actually debating with each other?
No, it's not better than it was before, and I'll tell you why. I have been a believer in the last 10 years that we were moving from the news era to the information age. In the news era, you had those, putting aside bias, those who were searching for what they believed to be the most important stories that the public needed to have. The information age, there's no one looking for that. You're just looking on your phone for something that's of interest to you. The tipping point came, ironically, I think, with the advent of cable news. I give this story as illustrative of what the problem became. In the 1960s, you had ABC, CBS, and NBC, full stop, where it came to television. So each one of those shows could command an audience of 10, 20, 30, 40 million. There's a lot of ka-ching where it comes to advertising revenue with that. What happened in time, because of cable, also because of talk radio in the early 1990s, Rush exploded the business model with what he did and everyone who followed him. What happened from there was that the news media were no longer giving the public what they believed to be news. They were having to give the public what the public wanted in order to remain profitable. Now, I underscored the phrase having to, this way. In I guess it was 1995, I was invited on CNN to critique the job they were doing covering O.J. Simpson. And this is back in the day when CNN would invite you to come on their network to critique them, when they had a backbone and they could do that kind of stuff. So I was quite critical of them as being the O.J. network and getting away from news. When I was done with it, Tom Johnson, the president of CNN, a good guy, was on the phone and wanted to talk to me. And he said, my job as president is to bring advertising revenue to the stockholders of CNN. That's my job. And he said, last year, we lost 25% of our audience. This year, we became the OJ network, and our audience went up 400%. If you're in my shoes, what would you do? I still can't answer that question. It's the existential question about television today. What worries me is that, yes, we have the podcast world, and it's great. Look, Donald Trump won because of podcasting. He won in 2016 because of Twitter. He won in 2024 because of podcasting. That's great for information. And I don't want to be stuffy and elitist, but it's not news. I am very concerned that we don't have a news media today and a real news media today. And because of that, I don't know that you can have a functioning democracy when this works. Look at what we have on cable. We have Fox News, we have CNN. I'm not knocking them. They have to do this as a business proposition. They are feeding their audiences. Fox is giving its conservative audience what its conservative audience wants to consume. CNN is giving the other 23 people in America what those 23 people want to consume. But that's the business model that they're following. Look on broadcast television. Once upon a time, you had the Today shows that spent a lot of time talking about news, and then you had your newscasts, you had your Dateline NBCs, you had your Nightlines on ABC. All that's gone. All those shows, except maybe the news, are there. But even half of the news content, and again, I'm not talking bias here, just news, just the content of it. Half of it is fluff. How many people in America know? I would ask this audience, how many of you know that Al-Qaeda is more powerful than it's ever been today? And you all are intelligent. And how many of you know that they've cut a swath across the center of Africa Very few people know that, but that is because it's not reported. There was a study done of the Second Iraq War. There was an organization that did an analysis of how many reporters were reporting outside the green zone of Iraq. Not one American. There were 3 reporters, not one American. Nobody was on the ground reporting the news from being on the ground, because you don't have assets anymore. We don't have bureaus out there anymore because it doesn't work on the business model. So I'm very, very concerned that we are illiterate when it comes to the consumption of news.
That speaks to, in a sense, a failure of institutional thinking, right? I mean, there's no institution dedicated to just that mission, and either the commercial side is totally subordinated to it or taken apart from it. And that's a.
And what do you do? Do you give it to PBS?
I think it's a very provocative. I think it's a very provocative thing to end on, though, because it speaks to something. The BBC is supposed to have a mission like that, but it can never keep to it.
And yet, if you want to know what the world's doing, go to BBC, because you're going to get news there. It may be slanted, but there's news.
So we're going to take questions now. We got about 50 minutes left, so I'll throw it out.
Okay, Michael, I've got 2 very popular questions from the audience for Brent. And the first is about his father and being a ghostwriter of Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. The question came from an audience member who said that they first read it in 1964 at the age of 11. So 60 years later, they have read it for the 4th time. It is still truth that persists. That's not entirely a question, though. I suppose it's an opportunity to reflect upon this achievement well over 60 years ago, because the book was first published in 1960. But if you want to take that up.
Well, my dad wrote that book in 19 days. That book, as of a few years ago, was the highest selling polemic in history. My dad thought it was terrible. And then he spent 7 years working on the Warren Revolution, which was a very, very in-depth, complex analysis of the Warren Court. Nobody bought it. So that's the last book he wrote for another 20 years. No, that book really was transcendent. It was, but my dad truly didn't think it was that great. I think he would have preferred to spend 3 years working on it and to really flesh out those ideas. There's a story told, I don't know if it's true. He thought it was so bad, he was offered the paperback rights and gave them away, which I hope is not true.
For what it's worth, I've read the Warren Revolution, and I also think that it's brilliant. So anyone in this room who can,
Oh, thank you.
please do so. So the next question is about your role now, which you haven't had your confirmation hearing yet, but for the U.S. Agency for Global Media. So some have asked what your mission will be, and others have asked about how you're going to go into this, given that President Trump is also trying to, by executive order, to disband the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
What the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. No, both those things are true. The president asked me to become the CEO of it. And then as soon as I accepted, I was told, you are now in charge of the most messed up agency in the federal government. As one person is quoted as having said, and this was in the Heritage Foundation Project 2025. By the way, Project 2025 is one of the most extraordinary documents produced by the conservative movement in my lifetime. And everyone should be very grateful to the Heritage Foundation for what they did. Their analysis and their playbook on USA GM was magnificent. They also quoted someone as saying, pound for pound, USA GM is the most corrupt agency in the entire federal government. And it is. I've not been confirmed, but that doesn't mean I can't study things. And I've done copious research. I've spoken with many people, and I've visited with many people. There are some good people there wanting to do noble work. You know, VOA is one of the greatest products of the greatest generation. And Radio Free Europe, our Uncle Jim headed it up during the Reagan administration. The contribution that VOA made in fighting Nazism was extraordinary. What Radio Free Europe did in the Eastern Bloc and Radio Liberty in the Soviet Union was historic. But what happened was that after the wall came down, after Hitler was defeated, and then after the wall came down, it really lost its sense of mission. So one of the questions I've asked people is what the mission was. And I've gotten all sorts of interesting answers from it, which tells you why the morale in this agency is lower than any other agency in America. Because people really can't explain what it is they're doing there. There is that. Then there are questions of personal corruption and allegations that are quite serious about, for example, 1,500 people brought in from around the world on visas that they were not allowed to come in on. And they'd been warned about this by the State Department and the national intelligence agencies. And they had disregarded them, and they brought them in under visas that allowed them to go beyond journalism. 1,500 came in, 500 have disappeared, and they're somewhere in the government. Nobody knows where they are. So there's serious stuff that's been alleged about this. Now, I was asked to come in and kind of fix it up. And by the way, the budget just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's now $950 million a year. USA GM has control over VOA and the Cuban Broadcasting Network, but there's a whole series of ancillary things that have broken off one by one. Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Network, and internet thing. They're all private foundations. Let me underscore that. Private foundations funded 100% by USA GM, by the American taxpayer. Private foundations. And then they set up a firewall. Yeah, and during the first Trump administration, they set up a firewall to prevent anybody at the CEO level from really doing anything to figure out what was going on with reporters because of the freedom of the press. So suddenly the CEO couldn't do anything. Then they went a step further and they set up this international advisory board. This isn't an advisory board. This is a board that has the power to tell the CEO he can't do what he needs to do. In other words, they have to approve whatever it is the CEO does. So the CEO position had been dramatically emasculated. So going into there, you knew there were horrific problems. Now the question was, if I was CEO right now, would I have said shut the whole thing down? Well, I'm not Doge. Doge was in there, and Doge has access to things that no one else does. And Doge has obviously found even worse things. So should it be shut down? Yes. Maybe bring it back alive as something else, focusing on our enemies. But I don't know that the present structure will survive.
Okay, I've got time for one last audience question. Did Joe McCarthy make it indefensible to call a communist, or was it just a matter of the persecution of him that did that?
No, I think you still can. I remember Bill was asked once why he stopped calling communists, why he stopped focusing on communists. And he said, I ran out of ways to call a communist a communist. No, I don't think there was a problem there at all. I think what it did was to give rise to the radical Hollywood left, which became very, very prominent in the 60s and 70s. I think that part has waned now. It's a generational thing. I think Joe McCarthy is in the rearview mirror today.
Yeah, I think that's right. Listen, I want to thank you for these reflections. Some of them very, very funny, and some of them, touching on pain points and the sacrifices that your father made. I mean, I think often we look back on the conservative movement and its history, and Bill Buckley lived this kind of glamorous life. I mean, I remember in the last year of his life, I was invited to his house in Stamford, and shortly after Pat died, and it was just, oh, come on down. He read something I wrote, thought I was promising, sat me down next to some obscure European royalty that happened to be at the house that day, and they were served by Spanish maids and an English butler, and I just thought it was amazing. But in your father's side, there was also a lot of sacrifice and suffering for the movement, and that probably comes with being a devout Catholic and chasing after the roots. So I just want to thank you personally, from my behalf, for the sacrifices your family has made for this movement, for this country, and let you all know that we all loved your dad and love you. So thank you. We got to wrap up right now, but I want to remind people. Just a programming note, please remain in your seats. There's going to be a quick set change up here, and the next session is beginning immediately. So hold it in, no comments, whatever you've got going on the inside, just wait. And thank you again so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
So thanks for doing the deal for Mitchell. Let's do this.
Let's do this thing.
Rock and roll. Red hot, ready to roll. I have to do this now because I have to run. How you doing, bud? Good to see you.
All right. So, hey.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carrie Severino, Meyer Soloveichik, Kristen Wagner, and David Bonson.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being part of this event. And I want to make sure at the beginning we have the opportunity to thank the Alliance Defending Freedom, who are the generous sponsor of this panel. They are doing amazing work promoting religious freedom nationwide and have some amazing legal wins to show for it that we're going to get a chance to talk about during the panel. We're going to have I'm going to direct some questions to each of the panelists, and then we'll have a chance toward the end to discuss amongst ourselves this issue of freedom of speech and maintaining the First Amendment that our nation has in its history and tradition is so important nowadays, and I think this will be a great opportunity to talk about some of the challenges we have before us. So just going down the line, we'll quickly introduce the panelists. Rabbi Meir Soloveichik is a well-known rabbi and speaker. He leads the Sephardic congregation Shereth Israel in New York City, which is the oldest Jewish synagogue in the country. He's also the director of the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, and he's a real leader in particularly interreligious dialogue as well, and building bridges between Judaism and Christianity. Kristen Wagner heads the Alliance Defending Freedom. She's the president, CEO, and general counsel, and she also was the lead counsel in many cases, but most notably recently, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that went to the Supreme Court. That was Jack Phillips, the cake baker, and the 303 Creative case, which had to do with the website designer that also went to the Supreme Court, and great wins in those cases. And she also leads ADF International. And then finally, we have David Bahnsen. He's the managing director and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a wealth management firm. He has been named by groups such as Forbes, Financial Times, and Bannon's Americas as one of the top advisors in the country. He's also on the board of the National Review Institute and a regular contributor there, as well as the host of Radio Free California, one of National Review's podcasts. And he's a frequent guest on TV and an author as well. So. Just to start off, I guess I want to direct a question to each of you to give some of your perspectives. We'll go in order. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, Vice President Vance recently warned about how the Europeans, about how our approach to religious freedom is diverging from their own, and that for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. What do you think? Is he right? Are we in a period of divergence? And if so, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this international contrast?
Well, I think that is right. And I think in a certain sense, the paths have diverged really from the very beginning, not just now. In other words, America's always had a unique approach to religious freedom that defines it and sets it apart, and certainly has defined the Jewish experience in America from the very beginning. As you mentioned very kindly, I am the rabbi of the oldest Jewish congregation in America. We don't like to talk about it except pretty much every day. And 1654 in New Amsterdam. But this is what makes America uniquely America. This is the, if I can cite the great theologian Yogi Berra, right, when he was told that the mayor of Dublin, Ireland is Jewish, he said, the mayor of Dublin, Ireland is Jewish only in America, right? And which is a brilliant line, though not, whenever I stay at a hotel, I always think of the line he said when he stayed at a hotel, which was, the towels there were so thick I could barely close my suitcase. But of course, from the very beginning, what set America apart from, say, revolutionary France is that it spoke not of freedom of worship, but of free exercise. And at the center of that was the notion that when you leave your home and enter public space, or to utilize more current controversies, when you seek to create a religious university or create a hospital that will be, on the one hand, rooted in a religious vision, but of course, reaching out to all of society, you don't stop being Jewish or Catholic when you are out there in the public square. And so that's what set apart, say, America from the French model of religious liberty. So on the one hand, of course, we see that divergence now without question. But to a certain extent, that divergence was always there. Abraham, my great uncle, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, well-known Talmudist and philosopher, said that to be a person of faith in the world is often to be as Abraham introduced himself in the land of Canaan. He said in Hebrew, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem, I am a stranger and a neighbor among you. Meaning that you are on the one hand a neighbor, you are a member of society, but you are also ever aware that you are set apart by your unique faith and your unique beliefs, by the covenantal community of which you are a part. And it's only in America, really, where people of faith have been able to simultaneously be both without sacrificing either. They could be fully a member of their faith, not just in their homes or in their synagogues or churches, but as members of society, while being full, equal members of society. That is always what has marked American uniqueness and why it's such a precious part of the American heritage and therefore worth preserving.
That's great. Your phrase, a stranger and a neighbor, makes me think of the kind of, I guess, Christian corollary, which is being in the world but not of it. So it's similar, obviously, drawn from the same tradition. And I think that actually is a little bit of the focus of some of the things Kristen can talk to us about in terms of the legal fights that are going on. A lot of them have to do with this question of how does a religious believer in a country that is increasingly irreligious or a-religious interact, and how can we navigate this process, protect their rights, even when maybe some of the religions that used to be a majority now find themselves in minority positions in society. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how the freedom of conscience and the fights that you're working on right now with ADF are playing out, and what the stakes are for how our society can navigate that in the world, but not of it.
Sure. Well, I don't know that the stakes could be any higher. I think that they are certainly as high as they've ever been in the last 2 generations in terms of these rights. I would say that, first of all, we're no longer debating the nuances or negotiating the outcomes of social issues. We are defining the rules of the game. And the rules of the game in terms of those basic rights in how you play the game. And it's a winner-takes-all moment in that respect, in that those who are advocating anti-religious hostilities, and largely in our institutions, are really focusing on taking control of the rules of the game by denying the right to free speech, by denying the right to conscience and demanding uniformity, and even coercion, which is something I don't think we've seen to this extent in the past, at least in our lifetimes. I would also say that it's a debate about whether society can tolerate dissent or pluralism. And in many respects, we at ADF have a global component, so we're working internationally. One of the cases you may have heard referenced in Vice President Vance's speech was one of our cases in the UK involving Adam Smith Connor, who was arrested and convicted for silently praying outside of an abortion clinic. We went to trial 2 weeks ago in Scotland involving someone who just simply held a sign up that said, "I'm here to help if you want to talk." We represent a member of parliament in Finland right now who simply voiced her disagreement on X about her church sponsoring a LGBT pride parade. She also faced 3 crimes, hate crimes, under Finland law. So I say that to say this: we are the last Western country in the world to resist these types of censorship and hate speech laws. The last country standing. All the more reason that we must stand in this moment and to see this for what it is, which is we're seeing an entirely new range of new blasphemy laws. Surely we've heard of blasphemy laws in the third world, and we represent individuals in Nigeria right now who are on death row. We represent individuals in other countries as well, Egypt. But these are the new blasphemy laws. If you disagree with the new sexual orthodoxy, as an example, you will pay a steep price. And while we might not all agree on what that sexual orthodoxy should be, we have to return to a place where we agree that you can disagree. And so I would just urge in this moment to be focusing on the fact that the rules of the game are what's being defined right now, and those fundamental freedoms that our society has depended on to be able to coexist, as the rabbi spoke about. That's what's being debated in the courts and the legislatures right now. And in a digital age, the polarization that we're occurring both on the right and on the left is going to have dire consequences if we don't all get into the game on this. That includes in the private space as well, because the collaboration that's going on between big tech and big banking with government in terms of censoring and forcing people to violate their faith is also a very real threat, and we need to come up with the right solutions. Hopefully we are, but it is a moment to stand and to be counted.
Well, thank you for that great transition, because our next speaker can speak directly to concerns about the way that, in particular, the banking has been used as a weapon to help silence conservatives and potentially religious groups as well. We've seen it, obviously, we've seen this happen in social media, and we've seen it happen in the broader media, and David Bahnsen has done a lot of work on the fighting the debanking of conservatives at JP Morgan. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work there and how the battle is going. Are we, in a lot of these battles, it feels maybe like the tide is starting to turn. Is it turning there as well?
Well, I think that the tide is turning, and I think that it is turning because some things are going in the right direction culturally, and there's a sort of feedback loop that had been very negative for some time that is now becoming more positive. It has turned into a PR nightmare for some of these organizations that I think had practiced some bad behavior to do so, where not practicing the bad behavior before was considered a risk to their organization. I'll give a real quick context on the issue with JP Morgan. I've been a shareholder in the bank since 2009, and at my firm we own over $100 million of the stock. You can own $2,000 and have a legal right to make a shareholder resolution. We were far above and away, and I was individually the threshold, and we made a resolution for them to consider as a proposal at the annual shareholder meeting. This would have been a few years ago now. In light of what had happened, maybe most of you know, but there was an incident in which the former governor and senator of the great state of Kansas, Sam Brownback, had a 501c3 that centered around religious liberty, had his account closed at JP Morgan Chase, got a runaround as to what the reason exactly was, and it became a public story, and JP Morgan vehemently denied that they were practicing debanking. And I became convinced, I hired my consultants and whatnot, I became convinced that it was not coming from Park Avenue, from the C-suite of the company, but there was some rogue middle manager who was indeed practicing debanking, and they didn't have the controls in place to stop it. So I simply filed a resolution saying, for the sake of shareholders, please run a process to ensure that this can't happen. You have such a large and complex organization. I believe at the time they were up to 250,000 employees. So what would be the mechanism necessary to keep this from happening? And they, for some reason, decided to deny my right to bring the resolution. So we sued them. ADF partnered with us. We had another law firm. We went to the SEC, who has often not been a friend of our cause, and we won. I don't think this thing would have gotten any oxygen at all if they hadn't denied my resolution. I think it would have gone to the shareholder meeting, it would have lost, they would have ignored it, and life would have gone on for them. But because of the successful litigation around it, it became a front page story in the New York Times, front page story Wall Street Journal. I had an op-ed published in the Journal, and I probably did about 50 appearances at Fox. They seem to not be able to get enough of this story. So at the end of the day, it allowed us to enter into a very constructive dialogue with them that has gone on to this day. And they have now since made abundantly public declarations that it has not, will not, cannot happen. They've gone on record with how many accounts they have for conservative organizations, for faith-based organizations. And I believe that their CEO, Jamie Dimon, is a very well-known American CEO, kind of a Manhattan moderate, if you will. I think he would fire people on the spot if he thought it was happening now, that the public relations around this became a nightmare. Fundamentally, what was happening in 2020 caused somebody to believe at some branch somewhere in the Midwest that they could get away with this. Right now, it's a liability to do something like this in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. That's how much the cultural winds have shifted, and certainly the new administration, President Trump made an issue of it at Davos with Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America. JP Morgan took out language. They had bought an online payments processor that had all kinds of restrictive stuff that if you're not practicing the right things around sexual orthodoxy, around pronouns, around all the different culture war issues, that we can just shut down your payment account. And they took all of that language out at our request. Anytime we call them, they take the call. And they're interested in partnering towards not being that way. They're not donating to National Review quite yet. But baby steps.
That's great to hear that there has been success. So via litigation, via, I guess, a combination of shareholder and public pressure, the tide can change. One thing this makes, another issue that I feel like we've been seeing that tide change on, and I wonder, Rabbi Soloveitchik, what your thoughts are on this, has been watching the anti-Semitism that cropped up in spades over the last year or so on campuses. Now, especially with the Trump White House coming, we're having a about face, right, and leaned on by the thumb of the federal government saying, no, you're going to lose your funding if we keep on seeing this. So on the one side, this is great news. On the other side, is there a point at which particularly government involvement then can become, I don't know, enforcing of orthodoxy in other directions. Where do you see that that debate going? And is it do you think that this direction of recognizing how outrageous some of the anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th has been is going to continue to move in the right direction, I guess? And
Yeah. So I'm personally not worried and actually very enthusiastic about the steps that have been taken by the administration. And I think I want to explain just very briefly why that's so. As we know, perhaps the most famous or controversial case now is a green card holder that was deported based on the legal right of the Secretary of State to designate that person's activities as contrary to the foreign policy and problematic to and threatening to the foreign policy of the United States. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think we've seen much sackcloth wearing and ashes placing about the future of our liberties. We've even seen the famous Niemöller quote cited, "First they came for Muhammad Khalil," and so forth, to which I think the proper response that somebody said on Twitter was, "First they came for Muhammad Khalil, and then they didn't come for me, probably because I'm a citizen and I didn't support a designated foreign terrorist organization." Okay? So, but we have to understand why this really is such. What does it mean to say that the Secretary of State is designating support for Hamas, active support for Hamas in America's elite or once elite universities as a threat to the foreign policy of the United States? I was asked by National Review to write about anti-Semitism just a few months after October 7th. And the case that I made was that the reason why that we are seeing such an explosion on this campus is because ultimately this is not only about the Jews, and that rightly understood, those representing these mobs don't just hate Jews and don't just hate the Jewish state. They hate America. The organization that this person was in the process of being deported represented, I think their phrase was, they're dedicated to the destruction of the West, or something like that. But
you're not hiding the ball.
No, and there's a reason why at pro-Hamas rallies, like the one that took place in front of Union Station here, American flags are desecrated. What does it have to do with this? The answer is, this is not only about the Jews. And so I concluded the piece by describing a moment in one of my favorite books, which is David McCullough's biography of Truman, where Truman is summoned as vice president to the White House, and he comes in and he sees Eleanor Roosevelt sitting there, and she says to him, "Harry, the president is dead." And it doesn't immediately register what that means for him. So he says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she replies, "Is there anything that we can do for you? Because you are the one who's in trouble now." And so I concluded by saying that when I see this explosion of anti-Semitism on city streets and college campuses, when I walk on the Sabbath from my synagogue home and I see a poster of a Jew taken hostage, including, as we know, babies, and see that many have tried to tear at that poster, because a poster of children or women or elderly men taken hostage. We see it, and then at the same time I've gotten some wonderful messages of encouragement and support from religious leaders around the country. And their message is largely, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And it's a very welcome message, but what I want to respond is, we are all the one who is in trouble now, because this is not just about the Jews. It's not just about the Jews. And so to say that colleges that not just tolerate anti-Semitism in explicit violation of the Civil Rights Act, but tolerate, and indeed among their faculty at times even embrace movements that are directly seek to undo the future of America and would hate American exceptionalism above all. And that therefore these universities will have to either face the bottom line through the possible taxation of endowments, and that those who are not citizens of this country may have to face the consequences. I think that's a perfectly American thing to do, and in my view, high time.
Right. So thinking about some of the battles with campuses attempting to impose their views on the students, it seems like places like Columbia are being now forced to actually defend all of their students even-handedly. But there are concerns still, particularly at the high school levels and other students, that their rights may not be being protected. And I know, Kristen, you're involved in several cases, including some that are coming up at the Supreme Court soon. Maybe you can talk about the status of freedom of speech, freedom of religion at the secondary school level, and the work that you guys are doing on that.
Sure, I think I'll probably address it from both levels. And I think to underscore where we're at right now in the culture, I can think of a once National Review columnist who's now a New York Times columnist who says, "What are you worried about? You're winning these cases." But the fact that we're having to fight them is particularly problematic. And the millions of victims that result that never get their case heard at the Supreme Court are also losing their businesses, losing their rights in the public schools. It leaves a mark. And so I just want to underscore that before I even start on this answer, and that at ADF we get upwards of 7,000 requests a year for help from Americans. Those are just the people calling in that have a problem in religious freedom or free speech areas. And it's largely involving the public schools and our college campuses. Many of those calls are coming from those places. That doesn't even include the strategic litigation that's going on where we're trying to be on offense. So I think that's important to realize. The fact that we're having to fight these issues is deeply concerning, and the center cannot hold much longer if more Americans don't stand up and insist on what's right. It is not a good place to be where we are relying on 1 or 2 votes at the United States Supreme Court to protect our rights. So along those lines, though, when we look at these campus cases and where we're seeing these threats come from, I want to highlight a few areas. The first is certainly in our public institutions, and also in our private institutions, because many of our teachers and school administrators are trained in public institutions. And so when there's institutional capture there, that naturally goes into the private sphere. We are seeing attacks related to teachers and counselors right now. Multiple cases, hundreds of calls where they're saying, I'm being told that I must secretly transition children to the opposite sex, lie to parents as a part of school policy. Multiple cases are involving that right now, where teachers have been fired, school counselors have been fired as a result of saying, I can't participate in this, I don't believe in this, and I don't believe that it's good for children. We're seeing one of our clients, we just settled the case this couple weeks ago, a professor who was canned from his position as the chair of child psychiatry at a large university because he dared to speak at a heritage panel and suggest, hey, maybe we shouldn't think about surgery on kids and medical experimentation before we talk and listen to them through counseling. Fired from his role, despite positive performance reviews. Another example is also with the students. Right now we have a cert petition before the Supreme Court where a child simply wore a t-shirt that said, there are 2 genders. Now you know what the other counter view is, and that those t-shirts are welcome in that school system in middle school. But he is told, if you come back with that shirt, you will be expelled. And you will face suspension first. We've lost that case in the current circuit. So if the court doesn't take it, that precedent is set. So we have to keep working on that. But other areas that you will see happen is we've moved on from simple things like you need a permit to speak, which is unconstitutional, or you have to speak in a certain area, you don't get access to the full case campus. Those are battles that we fought 15, 20 years ago. Or can the Bible School Club meet after school? Those are the common issues that used to happen. We've moved now to places where conservative and religious students in K-12 campuses as well as college campuses are being served no contact orders from their universities and their schools saying, we have had a complaint, you triggered someone, this was a microaggression, and that you gave utterance to a conservative view, and it made this other person feel uncomfortable. This is what our students are facing right now in these moments. And I think in terms of where we're at the U.S. Supreme Court, we have 3 cases this term that are being heard. I think 2 are significant in this area. One is called Drummond, which involves whether religious schools can participate in charter school programs to really bust up the public school monopoly that's going on. And the second case is called Childs, which involves 100 jurisdictions right now have laws in place that say if you are a counselor and you want to help a parent and a child, help that child overcome gender confusion, it's illegal to do so. Now just process that for a minute in terms of parental rights, free speech, and religious freedom. It's illegal to go get your child help and illegal for a counselor to provide that help. What is not illegal is for you to force them down a one-way conveyor belt that will cause them to be a lifetime patient for the rest of their life. And certainly the medical industry will thank you for that. Lastly, I would just say in these areas where we're thinking about these cases, there's a case by Beckett right now, which is Mahmood at the Supreme Court, which is about whether parents can opt their children out of this orthodoxy in the public schools. We used to be fighting about essentially trying to get opt-ins, like change the law. But now we're even having to fight about whether we can pull our kids out of a particular educational curriculum setting. So the stakes are high, but I'm also really hopeful, and I'll stop with this because I was just telling Carrie, we just got a win on the way here that I think does show a shift, and I think there's also a shift we're seeing in the women's sports context. But at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals this morning, we won a case unanimously on Idaho's law that was passed that said boys don't get to go into the girls' bathrooms. Hey, that was unanimously at the Ninth Circuit that we won that today. Less than 10 years ago, we couldn't even get that law passed in North Carolina. So just think about that and the role that the American people and parents can play as they vote, as they stand for what they know to be true.
Yeah, thank you. And David, we heard the rabbi talking about how just because we see a problem cropping up in kind of one area, that doesn't mean it's not indicative of deeper issues. It's not this, the anti-Semitism isn't just about that. It's about underlying things in the society. And I wonder what your thoughts are about, we've talked about the debanking in that particular area, but the issues with freedom of conscience, I think, can crop up in a lot of areas within within economic freedom and within the financial world. And I'd be curious of your thoughts of how those two issues interact with our economic freedom and then freedom of conscience.
Well, the interaction of those two dimensions is, to me, the core of the American experiment, that the unique synthesis of our religious liberty and our economic liberty was the profoundly American ideal. And there were other countries of some form of economic freedom. There were countries of various allowance of religious practice, but the American juxtaposition of the two is what made this the greatest country on God's green earth. And I fear a great deal that there are some who would like to sacrifice one for the sake of the other, or that there are some who do not realize how important the two being welded together are. The marriage of religious liberty and economic liberty is very important. For one thing, I believe economic liberty is fundamentally a byproduct of a value system, and that stems from religious ideals. But there's a tension in a pluralistic society that we have to hold. People are allowed to feel differently. They're allowed to have different opinions, and that is part of freedom of conscience. And yet they're not allowed to violate other rights. And we happen to have founding documents that define these things for us. And I believe it's very important we hold on to those ideals and principles, not take them lightly. I think what Kristen said a moment ago is profoundly important. I'm very grateful that we have won those cases at the Supreme Court a lot of times. But I agree with you that we do also have to wonder how it got to a point that we were within 1 or 2 votes away from losing something. I was sitting here thinking that we just got an ovation in a National Review room because there was a ruling that boys aren't allowed to go into a girl's bathroom. What in the world? I mean, we have to celebrate it because it's better than it was 10 years ago, but this is how fast the cultural needle is moved. And so the economic liberty is one that I'm convinced it's easy for us to take for granted. We live in a country of great prosperity, and it's easy to buy in to a form of class warfare, a form of envy of our neighbor that can undermine our economic liberty. It can happen in the legal system, in the financial system, in technology, but it can happen as a cultural and moral malady if we let it. And so to me, that juxtaposition of religious and economic liberty is the very thing I think we all ought to be fighting for.
Yeah, and you make a great point about how these are all so foundational and come from our roots, but I worry that with the direction our country is changing, in particular the increasing secularization, it's a challenge to keep our connection with those roots. And my experience, I mean, I worked in religious freedom at Beckett years ago, but also just watching this, it almost seems like even amongst people who are religious in within different traditions, at least if you have a religious practice of your own, you understand why other people need to have freedom rights and freedom of conscience as well. I think we may be facing a new type of challenge now, where there's a lot of people who, frankly, they do believe something, they just don't think of themselves as having religious beliefs. And so maybe they think, well, you know, who needs freedom of conscience? Who needs freedom of speech? Because they're in a position where they are maybe feeling like they're in the majority or in the kind of orthodoxy of the group that they're running in, and they don't think they have a conscience that needs protecting. I'd be interested in hearing all the members of the panel, and you guys can pop up in whatever order you feel, in terms of what do you think is unique about where we are now with the secularization of society, and how can we help rebuild those principles and those values when the next generation may not understand exactly why they're so foundational to our country. Yeah. So, I mean, we can keep going in the same order, or we can, yeah.
So I understand that exactly, and just to build on what my co-panelists have said, on the one hand, that we have to litigate some of these things is so perturbing and so astonishing. On the other hand, especially in the realm of religious liberty, and I'm proud to be on the board of the Beckett Fund and to be connected to some of these victories in some way. Think of what has been achieved just over the last 5 years. And to some extent, this actually embodies the state of conservatism itself, this tension, which has been the subject of this conference. When people ask me about how I see, how's it going in terms of the things we care about? So I like to cite what was, I think, said in British Parliament one time, where somebody stood up and said, yesterday our country stood on the edge of a great abyss, but today we have taken a great step forward, right? So on the one hand, we are in a cultural and moral abyss. On the other hand, think of the progress that we've made. The way I put it is, if you would have told me when I was, you know, a 16-year-old or 17-year-old reading National Review, if you would have told me that some decades later, you would have told me some of the things we'd be litigated, as David mentioned. They're litigating about boys going into girls' bathroom. I would have said, well, America had a good run, 1776 to 2024. That's a wrap, everybody. Okay. Now, if you had told me none of that, but you had just told me that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, which seemed really impossible. If you would have told me that the Blaine Amendment, right, all over the country, instituted as an anti-Catholic measure and utilized to restrict the flourishing of religion in America, was dead. If you would have told me about all of the different religious liberty victories that have happened recently, and you would have told me about the current composition of the Supreme Court, I would have said, if that's all you would have told me, I would have said, well, conservative movement, as far as the legal, you know, as far as the legal movement is concerned, we've achieved pretty much everything we were trying to achieve. Done. Yeah. We're done. That's a wrap, everybody. And the truth is, both are true. On the one hand, we need to celebrate what has been achieved. but we also need to know that we need to take another step forward and another step forward. And I'll just conclude by noting that, speaking as someone who cares about this from within the Jewish community, one of the wonderful things about this, and I know you see this in your own work, is that in fighting for this and fighting for this cause, different religious communities have found each other and have become allies in this cause. Just think about during COVID in 2020, when there was a victory at the Second Circuit, in which the New York policy was that there were restrictions that applied to people who wanted to pray in a church or a synagogue, but not when they wanted to go to a liquor store, right? So what were the two cases that were decided as one? Second Circuit and then the Supreme Court. The cases were Agudath Israel of America versus Cuomo and Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. And that we got those two decisions on Thanksgiving. It's a metaphor. And what that means is that we have renewed reason to be grateful for America, and we have renewed reason to be grateful in this very perturbing time for the way that different religious communities have found a fellowship in fighting for what America has been and, please God, will be in the future.
Yeah, that's great.
I'd respond in two ways. I think, first of all, taking us back to the beginning, we can look at what James Madison said in the Federalist Papers about the fact that in order to have our form of government, which is a unique experiment, we have to have and set a higher bar for virtue. And virtue doesn't come through a grand government experiment. It comes through mediating institutions, including the family. And that's what the National Review brand of conservatism is. It's that we understand that there are roles for each place in our society, and that those roles are important, so when the government chokes out the mediating institutions, it does all start to fall apart, which in some ways gives me hope, because I think everyone in this room has the opportunity to build that back. Whether you're interested in social issues or you're interested in overregulation, we know that the Constitution has two fundamental tenets or preconditions in it that it recognizes. One is human dignity, and the second is human frailty. And those visions have essentially allowed us to become the greatest civilization in the history of the world, and certainly have the most enduring Constitution. That gives me hope in this moment. The documents aren't broken. The second thing that gives me hope in this moment is that I think more and more people are waking up to their role to help form a moral and religious people, to help form the habits of a self-governing people. And more than anything else, that doesn't happen out there. It happens at our kitchen tables. We have the authority, with the responsibility and the privilege to turn this thing around. And with two kids who are in their 20s right now and one who's 17, I have great hope for the next generation. Because what the studies tell us is that a majority of kids in the next generation feel that they can't say the truth, that they can't give voice to their opinions. They also think that there should be hate speech exceptions in the First Amendment, which is profoundly misguided. But they're feeling this tension, and they're seeing how it's starting to fall in on itself. And we also see a resurgence of faith in this next generation. So I'm hopeful. 29 states now have put RFRAs in place. Those are laws that protect religious freedom. 10 years ago, that was unthinkable that they would move into that space. 2 weeks ago, one state just repealed gender identity as a protected class in its state law. Think about that for a minute. Almost unbelievable just 5 years ago. So I'm hopeful. We have a Blackstone training program that's training thousands of students who are in the top 14 law schools right now. And every summer they come and they say, not only am I not alone, but I'm going to do something with what God has given me. And they're committed to it. So now, 25 years into that program, we're seeing them leave big law or stand up in big law to insist on changes, or to go into corporate boardrooms and to make a difference. So I do think we have reason for hope, but we also have to know it doesn't happen without each of us doing our own parts.
Well, this is a wonderful way to get ready to wrap up our program, because this optimism is cheering me up, and it started with some optimistic comments from a rabbi and then a couple of Christians here to take it all the way home, you know what I mean? And you know, Bill Buckley used to say that despair is a sin, and fear not is the commandment repeated the most in the entire Bible. And I agree with both of my friends here on this panel. There are things that we are discouraged about, we're properly animated by, and we've all devoted a certain portion of our life and energy and resources to fighting. But one has to maintain a certain degree of optimism and hope. That encouragement is necessary, this community of faith and community of belief, because we want to protect the American ideal, is necessary, and it falls apart when we give in to despair. So there is a lot to be optimistic about, and Kristen's right to highlight a lot of the generational opportunities. I'm simply not convinced that today's 15 to 25-year-olds are going to suffer from a lot of the same things that a lot of their older millennial compadres have gone through, dealt with. I think we're dealing with different generational issues, and in that there's a lot of opportunity. But my final comment having to do with your original question about engaging the ability to express our religious ideals in the current culture. The one thing I want to say, regardless of what your faith tradition is or how you personally feel about truth claims, is that we have no chance of winning this battle if we hold on to the nonsense that we have religious claims and they don't. This myth of neutrality has got to go. All we're talking about is A, whose truth claims, and B, how we're going to coexist peacefully in society when sometimes we disagree with one another, which was the tensions our founders sought to address 250 years ago. But what has hurt us so much, sometimes in court, sometimes in culture, in schools, and oftentimes in the workplace, is the idea that we're having a religious and moral battle that we're imposing, but the other side is over there with this blank canvas of amoral neutrality. It is not true. There's a war over truth going on. The truth must prevail. Our side is willing to make the case for our truth claims peacefully, charitably, and in a structurally pluralistic context. I don't believe any Christian or conservative or Jewish or Catholic friend of mine ever has sought to terminate people at their work because of what they believe. It's always the other way. But we are handicapping ourselves by accepting a rule of engagement, as Kristen talked about, that we're the ones trying to violate neutrality. Ultimately, this is a philosophical issue that matters a great deal. There is a battle over ideas, over truth claims, and I believe we need to fearlessly engage that fight, that we are fighting for real truth claims that are rooted to transcendent truth. So help me God.
Well, I can't think of a better way than to end on this wonderful, positive view for the future. We definitely are living in an era that has unprecedented, well, probably not unprecedented, but has serious struggles with freedom of speech, struggles with freedom of religion, but we're up to the challenge. And it's exciting to hear the optimism, particularly about the next generation carrying this battle on, and the virtues that we all are advocating to bring this nation into a deeper appreciation for really our core values that we've had for the last 250 years. So I want to thank again Alliance Defending Freedom for sponsoring the panel, and thank you all for being a wonderful audience, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon at NRI.